The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the grand palace, but something was terribly wrong. Guards stood at every corner with faces carved from stone, their eyes avoiding contact with anyone who passed. The usual bustle of servants had been replaced by hushed whispers and quick, nervous footsteps. Maria Rodriguez had worked in the palace kitchens for 15 years, but she had never seen anything like this. The head chef, usually loud and commanding, moved silently between the stoves. No one dared speak above a whisper. The breakfast trays that normally went up to the royal quarters sat untouched on the counter. "Have you heard anything?" Maria whispered to Elena, her closest friend among the kitchen staff. Elena shook her head, her hands trembling as she kneaded bread. "They say someone important died in the night, but no one knows who. The palace guards sealed off the entire East Wing at 3 in the morning. The East Wing housed the most important members of the royal family." Maria's heart raced as she thought about the possibilities. King Eduardo was 78 years old and had been in declining health. Queen Isabella, though younger at 65, had suffered from heart problems. Their eldest son, Prince Carlos, had just returned from a diplomatic mission abroad. Their daughter, Princess Sofia, lived in the East Wing with her 2 young children. Throughout the morning, more strange things happened. The palace physician, Dr. Mendez, rushed through the corridors with his medical bag, his face pale and drawn. The Prime Minister arrived before dawn, followed by the Minister of Defense and other high-ranking officials. They all disappeared into the sealed section of the palace. Maria watched from a window as black cars continued to arrive. She recognized judges, military generals, and even religious leaders. Whatever had happened, it was serious enough to summon the most powerful people in the country in the middle of the night. By noon, the tension in the palace had become unbearable. Servants clustered in small groups, sharing rumors and fears. Some said they had heard crying from the East Wing. Others claimed to have seen members of the royal guard weeping openly, something that never happened. "This is different from when Prince Albert died," whispered Thomas, an elderly butler who had served the palace for 40 years. Prince Albert had been the king's brother, and when he passed away 5 years ago, the palace had immediately announced his death and begun preparations for a state funeral. "Why are they hiding it?" Elena asked. "If someone has died, why don't they tell us?" Thomas looked around nervously before answering. "Sometimes a death can change everything. Sometimes the timing matters more than the truth." Maria didn't understand what he meant, but his words sent chills down her spine. She thought about the country's political situation. There had been protests in the capital city for months. People were unhappy with rising prices and unemployment. The opposition party had been gaining strength, calling for major reforms. If something had happened to the king or the heir to the throne, it could throw the entire nation into chaos. As the afternoon wore on, Maria noticed more unusual activities. Documents were being burned in the palace courtyard. She watched from her window as guards fed paper after paper into metal drums, the smoke rising black against the sky. In another part of the palace, she saw servants carrying boxes of files to waiting trucks. "They're destroying evidence," Elena said, standing beside her at the window. "Evidence of what?" Maria asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. The palace press secretary, a woman named Carmen Vega, appeared briefly in the main hall. Reporters had been gathering outside the palace gates since morning, but Carmen told the staff that no announcements would be made that day. Her usually confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something that looked like fear. As evening approached, Maria was called to prepare dinner for the officials who remained in the palace. She and 3 other kitchen staff members prepared simple meals and carried them to a conference room near the sealed East Wing. As she set down the trays, she caught glimpses of documents on the table. One word jumped out at her: succession. Succession meant the transfer of power from one ruler to the next. Maria's hands shook as she poured coffee for the grim-faced officials. She wanted to run from the room, but she forced herself to remain calm and professional. On her way back to the kitchen, Maria passed a room where she heard muffled crying. Through a crack in the door, she saw Princess Sophia collapsed in a chair, her face buried in her hands. The princess's lady-in-waiting stood beside her, offering tissues and speaking in low, comforting tones. Maria's worst fears seemed to be confirmed. If Princess Sophia was grieving this deeply, it had to be someone very close to her. Her parents? Her brother? Her husband had died in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving her a widow at 35. Surely it couldn't be one of her children? Back in the kitchen, Maria found the staff in an uproar. Someone had overheard 2 guards talking about preparing the royal crypt. The underground burial chamber beneath the palace chapel was only opened for members of the immediate royal family. "It's the king," declared Philippe, one of the senior chefs. "It has to be. That's why they're being so secretive. They're afraid of what will happen when people find out." But Maria wasn't convinced. She remembered the word succession on those documents. If the king had died, the succession was clear. Prince Carlos would become king. Unless something had happened to Prince Carlos as well, the thought was too terrible to contemplate. Prince Carlos was only 45 years old, healthy and popular with the people. He had 3 teenage children who were away at boarding school in Switzerland. If something had happened to him, it would explain the panic among the officials. As night fell, the palace took on an even more surreal atmosphere. The lights in the East Wing remained on, casting eerie shadows through the windows. Guards patrolled the grounds with dogs, their flashlights sweeping across the gardens. The main gates had been closed to all visitors, something that hadn't happened since a terrorist threat 10 years earlier. Maria was preparing to leave for the night when she was stopped by the head of household staff, Mrs. Patterson. The older woman looked exhausted, her usually perfect appearance disheveled. "Maria, I need you to stay tonight," Mrs. Patterson said. "We're keeping a skeleton crew in case anything is needed." "Of course," Maria replied, though her heart sank. She had hoped to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the palace, if only for a few hours. As she settled in for what promised to be a long night, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing history in the making. Whatever secret the palace was hiding, it was big enough to shake the foundations of the monarchy itself. And somewhere in the sealed East Wing, the truth waited like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode and change everything. The palace clock struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through empty corridors. Maria sat in the kitchen with 5 other staff members who had been asked to stay. They played cards half-heartedly, but everyone's attention was on the sounds coming from other parts of the palace. Footsteps echoed overhead, doors slammed. Once they heard what sounded like furniture being moved. The mystery of who had died was eating away at everyone's nerves. Maria had tried calling her daughter to let her know she wouldn't be home, but the palace phone lines had been restricted. Only emergency calls were being allowed through. Around 1 in the morning, something extraordinary happened. A helicopter landed on the palace's private helipad. Maria and Elena rushed to a window and watched as several figures in dark clothing emerged. Even in the darkness, Maria recognized one of them. It was Prince Marcus, the king's younger brother who lived in exile in Portugal. He had been banished from the country 20 years ago after a scandal involving embezzled funds. "If they're bringing Marcus back, something catastrophic has happened," Elena whispered. Prince Marcus had always been considered the black sheep of the royal family. His return could only mean that the line of succession was in serious jeopardy. Maria felt her blood run cold as she considered the implications. The kitchen door burst open, startling everyone. Mrs. Patterson stood there, her face grave. "I need 2 volunteers to help prepare the Blue Room," she said. The Blue Room was the palace's most formal chamber, used only for the most important state occasions. Maria and Elena raised their hands. They followed Mrs. Patterson through corridors they rarely entered, past priceless paintings and ancient tapestries. The Blue Room was a magnificent space with soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers. But tonight, it was being transformed into something else. Workers were draping the room in black cloth. The windows were being covered, and a raised platform was being constructed at one end of the room. Maria realized with growing horror that they were preparing for a lying in state, the formal display of a deceased royal's body for public mourning. "Who are we preparing this for?" Elena dared to ask. Mrs. Patterson's lips tightened. "You'll know soon enough. For now, just do your work and speak to no one about what you see here." As they worked, Maria noticed more clues about the mysterious death. A portrait was being removed from the wall. She caught a glimpse of it before it was covered and carried away. Her heart nearly stopped. It was a formal painting of Prince Carlos and his family. "No," she whispered to herself, "it can't be." But the evidence was mounting. Prince Carlos had 3 children, twin boys aged 17 and a daughter aged 15. If something had happened to him, the succession would pass to his eldest son, Prince Alexander. But Alexander was still a minor, which would require a regency until he came of age. This would explain the panic among the government officials. As dawn broke, exhausted staff members were given a brief rest. Maria dozed fitfully in a chair, plagued by nightmares of a kingdom in chaos. She was awakened by the sound of cars arriving. Through the window, she saw several ambassadors from neighboring countries entering the palace. International involvement meant this was even more serious than she had imagined. By 7 in the morning, the palace could no longer maintain its silence. Reporters had camped outside the gates all night, and crowds of concerned citizens were beginning to gather. The pressure for information was becoming intense. Maria was serving breakfast to the overnight staff when Thomas, the elderly butler, sat down beside her. His face was ashen and his hands trembled as he lifted his teacup. "I overheard something," he whispered. "Something terrible." Maria leaned closer, her heart pounding. "It wasn't just one death," Thomas continued. "There were multiple casualties, some kind of accident or attack. Multiple casualties." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Her mind raced through the possibilities. The entire royal family had been together just 3 days ago for Princess Sophia's birthday celebration. What if they had been traveling together? What if there had been a plane crash or a car accident? The morning brought new mysteries. A team of investigators arrived, their vehicles bearing no official markings. They disappeared into the sealed East Wing with cases of equipment. Through an open door, Maria glimpsed what looked like forensic specialists in white coveralls. "They're treating it like a crime scene," Elena observed. This changed everything. An accident was one thing, but if members of the royal family had been murdered, it would be the crime of the century. Maria thought about the recent protests, the angry crowds demanding change. Had someone taken matters into their own hands? Around 10 o'clock, the Prime Minister emerged from his marathon meeting looking haggard. He spoke briefly to Carmen Vega, the press secretary, who nodded grimly and began making phone calls. It seemed an announcement was finally being prepared. Maria was clearing dishes when she overheard 2 guards talking in hushed tones. "The children are being brought back from Switzerland," one said, "under heavy security." This confirmed Maria's worst fears. If Prince Carlos's children were being brought home under heavy security, their father must be dead. The thought of those 3 teenagers learning they were orphans made her heart ache. The palace chapel bells began to toll at 11 o'clock. They rang slowly, mournfully, in the pattern reserved for royal deaths. The sound seemed to release something in the palace. Servants who had held back their emotions for hours began to weep openly. Even the stern-faced guards looked shaken. Maria found herself in the chapel, along with dozens of other staff members who had come to pray. The priest, Father Miguel, led them in prayers for the deceased, though he carefully avoided mentioning any names. His voice shook as he spoke about tragedy, loss, and the mysterious ways of God. As they filed out of the chapel, Maria noticed something that made her gasp. A row of coffins was visible through a side door. Not just one or two, but at least 4, possibly more. They were covered in royal purple cloth embroidered with gold. "Dear God," Elena breathed beside her, "how many have we lost?" The answer came sooner than expected. At precisely noon, television screens throughout the palace were turned on. Carmen Vega appeared, standing at a podium in the palace press room. Her face was composed, but Maria could see the strain in her eyes. "It is with the deepest sorrow that I must inform the nation of a tragedy that has befallen our royal family," Carmen began. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion. Maria held her breath, waiting for the names, the details, the explanation for all the secrecy. But Carmen's next words shocked everyone. "Due to the sensitive nature of this situation and ongoing investigations, we cannot release full details at this time. What I can confirm is that multiple members of the royal family have died under circumstances that require careful examination. His Majesty the King requests the nation's patience and prayers during this difficult time." The king was alive. This revelation sent murmurs through the gathered staff. If King Eduardo had survived whatever had killed other members of his family, why had there been talk of succession? Carmen continued, "A period of national mourning will be announced once we can provide more information. We ask the media and the public to respect the privacy of the grieving family members and to avoid speculation that could hamper the investigation." The press conference ended without naming the victims or explaining how they had died. If anything, it raised more questions than it answered. Maria felt frustrated and frightened in equal measure. The palace had confirmed multiple royal deaths, but refused to say who had died or how. Throughout the afternoon, the palace remained in a state of suspended animation. Staff went about their duties mechanically, everyone waiting for more information. Maria noticed that certain areas of the palace were being thoroughly cleaned, not normal cleaning, but the kind of deep sanitization that suggested something terrible had happened there. She was passing through a corridor when she heard voices from a partially open door. Against her better judgment, she paused to listen. "The poison was in the wine," a man's voice said. "Everyone who drank from that particular vintage." "How many?" another voice asked. 6 confirmed dead. 2 more in critical condition. If they don't survive." Maria fled before she could hear more. Poison, murder, 6 members of the royal family dead, possibly 8. The magnitude of the crime was staggering. Someone had managed to poison multiple royals at once, probably during a family gathering. Her mind went back to Princess Sophia's birthday celebration 3 days ago. It had been a private family dinner in the East Wing. Only the immediate family and their spouses had attended. If someone had poisoned the wine at that dinner, Maria felt sick as she realized the full horror of what must have happened. A family celebration turned into a massacre. Children watching their parents die. The killer must have been someone with access to the royal wine cellar. Someone trusted. As evening approached, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Maria saw palace security reviewing footage from dozens of cameras. She overheard mentions of a missing servant, someone who had failed to report for work since the night of the deaths. The investigation was focusing on an inside job. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Maria was in the kitchen preparing evening meals when Mrs. Patterson gathered all the staff together. Her face was streaked with tears, and she looked as if she had aged 10 years in the past day. "I've been given permission to tell you what happened," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to know the truth, and it will be public knowledge soon anyway." The room fell silent. Even the ever-present hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade as everyone leaned in to listen. 3 nights ago, at Princess Sophia's birthday dinner, 8 members of the royal family were poisoned. The poison was in a special vintage wine that was served only to the family table. Mrs. Patterson paused, struggling to maintain her composure. The victims were Prince Carlos, his wife Princess Marie, Princess Sophia, Prince Edmund, and his wife Lady Catherine, Princess Isabella, the king's cousin, and... She broke off, unable to continue. Thomas, the elderly butler, finished for her. And the 2 youngest victims, Prince Alexander and Prince Nicholas, the 17-year-old twins. Gasps and cries filled the room. The twins were beloved by everyone in the palace. They were bright, kind young men who always had a smile and a kind word for the staff. The thought of them dying alongside their parents was unbearable. "What about Princess Gabriella?" someone asked, referring to Prince Carlos's 15-year-old daughter. "She survived," Mrs. Patterson said. "She doesn't drink wine. Neither did Prince Marcus's young son, who was also at the dinner. They are the only 2 children who survived that night." Maria felt her legs go weak. She sank into a chair as the full horror washed over her. An entire generation of the royal family had been wiped out in a single evening. Prince Carlos, who should have been the next king, his sons, who would have followed him, Princess Sophia, the beloved humanitarian, all gone. "Who did this?" Elena demanded, her voice shaking with rage. Mrs. Patterson's expression hardened. "Roberto Sanchez. He worked in the wine cellar for 3 years. He disappeared that night, but the police found him trying to cross the border. He has confessed." Roberto Sanchez. Maria knew him. A quiet man in his 40s who kept to himself. He had always seemed dedicated to his work, proud of maintaining the royal wine collection. What could have driven him to commit such a monstrous act? "He was part of an extremist group," Thomas added. "They believed the monarchy should be abolished. He specifically chose that vintage because he knew it was reserved for the family table. He added the poison just hours before the dinner." The room erupted in angry voices and tears. Maria thought about how Roberto had smiled and nodded at her in the corridors, all while planning the murder of children. The betrayal felt personal, as if he had attacked not just the royal family, but everyone who worked in the palace. "Why keep it secret for so long?" someone asked. Mrs. Patterson sighed deeply. "The government feared mass panic. With so many heirs dead, the succession was thrown into chaos. Princess Gabriella is now second in line to the throne after her elderly grandfather. They needed time to secure the palace, investigate whether Roberto had accomplices, and make arrangements for the surviving family members' safety." The implications were staggering. King Eduardo, at 78, had lost his son, daughter, nephew, and 2 grandsons in one night. Queen Isabella had survived because she had been feeling unwell and hadn't attended the dinner. Now she and the king were left to raise their orphaned granddaughter and prepare her for a throne she should never have been close to inheriting. Over the next hour, more details emerged. The 2 who had been in critical condition, Prince Edmund's wife, Lady Catherine, and Princess Isabella, the king's cousin, had both died during the night despite desperate medical efforts. The death toll stood at 8 members of the royal family. The palace had been in lockdown to prevent any accomplices from escaping or causing more harm. Every servant, guard, and official had been questioned. The burning of documents Maria had witnessed was the destruction of sensitive succession papers that needed to be rewritten. The international ambassadors had been briefed because the kingdom's stability affected the entire region. "There's more," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Roberto didn't work alone. 3 other palace employees have been arrested. They were part of the conspiracy, helping to plan the attack and ensure Roberto had access to the wine." This news sent another shockwave through the room. Maria looked around at her colleagues, wondering if any of them had known. The thought that people she worked beside every day had been part of this plot was terrifying. As the evening progressed, preparations for the public announcement intensified. Maria was assigned to help prepare refreshments for the press conference that would shock the world. As she worked, she thought about Princess Gabriella, the 15-year-old girl who had lost her parents and brothers in one horrible night. The child who would now have to prepare to be queen one day. Just before the announcement, Maria was called to help serve tea in a private room. There she saw King Eduardo for the first time since the tragedy. The robust man she had known was gone, replaced by a broken figure who seemed to have shrunk into himself. Beside him sat Queen Isabella, holding his hand and whispering words of comfort. In the corner of the room sat a young girl with long, dark hair, Princess Gabriella. She was surrounded by security guards and counselors, but she looked utterly alone. Her eyes were red from crying, and she stared at nothing, lost in her grief. Maria's heart broke for her. At 15, Gabriella should have been worrying about school exams and friends, not preparing to be heir to a throne. She had gone to bed 3 nights ago as the younger sister, the one who could live a relatively normal life. Now she carried the weight of the kingdom's future on her young shoulders. At 8 o'clock that evening, the king himself appeared on television. The entire palace stopped to watch. Staff members crowded around every available screen. Maria stood with Elena and Thomas, holding hands as they waited for the words that would change their nation forever. King Eduardo looked every one of his 78 years. His voice, usually strong and commanding, trembled as he began to speak. "My dear people, it is with a heart heavier than I ever imagined possible that I speak to you tonight. Our family, our kingdom, has suffered a loss beyond words. 3 nights ago, during what should have been a joyful family celebration, 8 members of our royal family were murdered." He named them all, his voice breaking when he reached his grandsons. The king explained how the poisoning had occurred, Roberto Sanchez's arrest and confession, and the ongoing investigation into his accomplices. He spoke of the senseless hatred that had driven the killers, their twisted belief that murdering innocents would somehow advance their cause. "They sought to destroy not just my family, but the stability of our nation," the king said, his voice gaining strength. "They have failed. We remain united. Our kingdom will endure, and those responsible will face justice." He spoke of Princess Gabriella, asking the nation to support and protect her as she prepared for responsibilities no child should have to bear. He announced a week of national mourning and a state funeral for all 8 victims. As the broadcast ended, the palace erupted in grief. The secret was finally out, and with it came a tidal wave of emotion that had been held back for 2 days. Maria found herself sobbing in Elena's arms, mourning not just for the royal family, but for the innocence lost, the trust betrayed. In the days that followed, the kingdom reeled from the news. The state funeral was attended by royalty and leaders from around the world. Millions lined the streets as 8 coffins were carried to the royal crypt. Princess Gabriella walked behind her family's coffins, her grandfather on one side and her grandmother on the other, the 3 of them united in their devastating loss. Roberto Sanchez and his 3 accomplices were quickly tried and sentenced to life in prison. Their extremist group was disbanded, its members arrested or driven underground, but the damage they had done could never be undone. Maria continued working at the palace, but it was never the same. The laughter was gone from the corridors. Every meal served was a reminder of that fatal dinner. Security became oppressive, with every servant subjected to constant scrutiny. Princess Gabriella began her training to be queen, aged far beyond her years by tragedy. The palace that had once echoed with the voices of children now felt like a tomb. King Eduardo's health declined rapidly, the loss of his family having broken something fundamental in him. 2 years later, When King Eduardo died peacefully in his sleep, 17-year-old Gabriella ascended to the throne. Maria was there for the coronation, watching as the young woman who had lost everything somehow found the strength to lead her nation. Queen Gabriella's first act was to create a memorial garden in the palace grounds, with 8 trees planted for the family members she had lost. It became a place of pilgrimage for people who wanted to remember the tragedy and honor the victims. Maria often walked in that garden, remembering the princes who had thanked her for their meals, the princess who had always asked about her family, the night when evil invaded their sanctuary and changed everything forever. The palace in Mourning had kept its terrible secret for only 2 days, but those 48 hours had felt like a lifetime. The shock of discovering who had died and how they had been murdered would never fully fade. It was a reminder that even in places of greatest security, surrounded by those we trust, tragedy can strike without warning. But it was also a testament to resilience. A kingdom that could have fallen into chaos instead stood strong. A girl who should have been destroyed by loss instead became a beloved queen. And in the palace kitchens, life went on, one meal at a time, carrying the memory of those lost, but not the poison of hatred that had tried to destroy them all.